Chris Wylie is a social researcher and a data scientist. He served as a senior advisor to both the BC and federal governments in Canada. He has extensive experience using technology to improve communication and citizen engagement. I read that as protecting democracies. He's an avid interest in the cultural applications of technology, and he has a postgraduate research focused on fashion trend forecasting. And today, we're here to talk to you a little bit about one of the reasons that you've been in the spotlight recently, and that is that you were a former director of research at Cambridge Analytic and the SEL Group, which is described as a UK-based military contractor specializing in information warfare. Probably the most interesting description of a company I've ever read. Earlier this year, Chris worked with The Guardian and the New York Times and Channel 4 in the UK, taking an enormous personal risk, in my opinion, and acting as a whistleblower to expose how social media and the data therein were being used and exploited and turned against ordinary citizens, I'd call them, like you and I. So, Chris, for people that are in the audience here and have heard your name perhaps, but don't know everything about what you've done, can you just take a minute to start with what was Cambridge Analytica? Yeah, so I think it's important for people to understand actually what were the origins of Cambridge Analytica, because when I started, Cambridge Analytica didn't exist. I started as a research director at a company called SEL Group, which was a military contractor. 80% of our work was mostly for the Ministry of Defense in the UK and the Department of Defense in the United States. And I got hired because they had an opening for a research director. And at the time, so this would have been back in 2013, DARPA, which is the US military's research agency, was putting in quite a bit of investment in looking at how information spreads online and how you can profile people who receive or transmit information. And that was because when you look at the challenges of sort of modern day conflict with non-state actors like ISIS, they recruit online, they organize online, everything happens online. And when you are Western countries, like the United States, you know, their budgets were so large that generals were like boys with toys, so they want to get more tanks or missiles or things that blow up. And also, when you think about it, if you are a data scientist or if you are an engineer, your ambition isn't to go work in the army, right? You can go work at Google or Facebook or whatever, and sit in a beanbag jar, smoke weed, whatever. So the NATO countries had fallen quite behind in terms of what's called non-kinetic approaches to warfare and combat. And so SEL, being one of the main contractors in this space, was looking to expand its operational capacity to take traditional psychological and information operations from the analog or temporal world into cyberspace. And so I got hired. I didn't know that at the time that I was actually replacing the last research director who died in his hotel room in Kenya, but I was told that later. Anyway, so how did Cambridge Analytica actually come about? It's sort of a funny story. One of our clients at SEL, who worked for US Air Force Cyber Command, was on a plane, and sitting across from him was a guy named Mark Block, who is a Tea Party alt-right campaigner. And as Americans do, they just start talking to each other. And at the end of this conversation on a plane, Mark Block goes, "Oh, I wish we could use what you do." And he gives him the card of a guy called Alexander Nix, who was a director at SEL Group, and said, "Well, I can't, but we've got a firm that works for us that might actually do something for you." So Alexander Nix, who was a director at SEL Group, gets invited to New York and meets a guy by the name of Steve Bannon. And when you look at what Steve was doing at the time, he was setting up Breitbart in the UK, just taken over in the United States. And when Andrew Breitbart set up
the company, before he died, he said that he wanted to set up something that would create enduring cultural change. And so he'd always say that politics exists downstream from culture, so don't change politics, change culture. And this is where this idea of culture war came from. And so when you think about that word, culture war, you need an arsenal of weaponry in order to fight a war. And Breitbart wasn't doing very well at that job because it became very niche. You know, it sort of ended up being a platform for like angry straight white men who can't get laid to, you know, bitch about women. And the conversation that he had with Alexander Nix then later turned into an acquisition of the company by an alt-right billionaire. And from that, they set up Cambridge Analytica. But I think what's really important for people to understand about Cambridge Analytica is that the tactics and techniques that it was using originated in R&D for the military, right? So when you are doing R&D in information operations to degrade the efficacy of ISIS recruitment, the agency and autonomy of that ISIS fighter is not a consideration, because the way the military looks at it is, well, you can either send in a drone and blow that guy up, or you can deceive, trick, confuse, create paranoia, make him leave on his quote-unquote own volition by disseminating information or disinformation via online or via, you know, rumors and all that in the temporal space. That's really important for people to understand, because if you think about how you would treat an ISIS fighter or an ISIS recruiter and how you would treat a voter, they're very different contexts, right? And so what's fair game in a combat situation is the antithesis of a functioning democracy, right? If you're a terrorist, I can trick you, I can deceive you, right? I can start rumors about you, I can defame you, I can do essentially anything that I want to you because the military considers you an eligible target to kill. So in terms of the informational space, you're fair game. If you're a voter, right, and you get led down the garden path, you are targeted in the same way. We find you, and we identify you know, dispositional attributes in you that make you more inclined to engage with paranoid thinking, for example, right? Or conspiratorial thinking, or racial biases. And we start to unpack that in you by disseminating information to you, which is not necessarily true, but is conducive to amplifying your dispositional starting point. And then let's say we invite you to a Facebook group. We invite you to a page, right? And we say, join this page, and you do. And you join Smith County Patriots, right? And it looks great, and there's lots of people talking, and they all start talking about all these things that you kind of want to believe, and you do start to believe. And then you have conversations with Joe. Joe's from out of state, so you've never met him. And actually, you know, spoiler alert, Joe's not real, but you think he's real. And you start having a conversation on these groups, on these pages. You start reading articles that look like they're news articles, but they're not. And then when this group, Smith County Patriots, gets up to 1,000, 2,000 people, then there's an event. And all of a sudden, everyone's invited to this event at the local Starbucks in the county. And if only 5% of people attend that event, you've got 50 to 100 people flooding, bombarding a Starbucks. And all of a sudden, you go from a fantasy online into a Starbucks, into the real space, right? And you see tons of people from your community all flooding this Starbucks. And for you, you think all of a sudden, everyone in my community thinks like me. And CNN, they're not talking about it. NBC, they're not talking about it. And actually, they're not real, this is real. And what started as a fantasy online then becomes real for you. And in the military, you call that insurgency building. And that's what Steve Bannon wanted to do. He built an insurgency, and he used a military contractor to do it. And that's what Cambridge Analytica did. That's
Fascinating. So that's capturing a lot of what Cambridge Analytica did. And summarizing some of that is Cambridge Analytica built tools or weapons for social warfare or social change.
Yeah, the Canadian government was a client of SCL, by the way.
And I
in the
agree with you.
Baltics. The NATO Stratcom Center, which the Canadian government funds, was operated in part by SCL Group.
So, and it's clear there's a difference between tactics in the military and campaigns or tactics, if you'll call them that, in a political campaign or within democracies. And there should be a difference between the two of those. This, it sounds like the lines were drawn in a different way. I do remember, and people will know that one of the first words that comes out after a description of Cambridge Analytica is Facebook, and how Cambridge Analytica used Facebook data, and you know, personally, I don't take a lot of surveys online, but I do remember a quiz. And when all of this came out, when you brought it out for us, I read about a quiz. And a quiz is a very different thing than a survey, although they may operate the same way. And I recall the quiz. I remember taking a quiz when I was on Facebook.
Girl,
and
do we have your data?
Indeed, people in this crowd might have taken that same quiz. And you know, I think my profile at the end of it was, you know, willing to take surveys or willing to take quizzes. But obviously, I provided information to the quiz and whoever collected that information.
Did you read the T's and C's? Lol.
Yeah, nobody does.
Lol.
But even if I did,
you want to know something kind of like funny / insidious? Is that like the application that was created by Cambridge Analytica? The terms and conditions of that application was submitted in the review process to Facebook, and Facebook authorized it and knew about it. And in the Senate testimony and then the parliamentary testimony recently of Facebook, they said it was our mistake because we didn't read the terms and conditions. Lol.
Wow. So
I don't know why we got these T's and C's. No one reads them, not even Facebook.
It may be that those T's and C's, the fact that nobody reads those T's and C's is important, because later they won't stand up in court if nobody is reading them, even the people that are writing them. But
I mean, have you ever read them? God, I got lawyers to look at them, and they don't even understand them.
That doesn't surprise me. Now, in your bio and my description of you, I described you as focused on fashion trend forecasting. That, to me, seems a long way from the important description of Cambridge Analytica, which I'll read again.
It's the same thing.
As a UK-based military contractor specializing in information warfare. Tell me that it's different.
You know that, okay, so like, fashioning your thinking is like really helpful to understand like this sort of upside down postmodern world that we live in. You know, like I think of Donald Trump, he's like Crocs. You know Crocs, like I don't even want to call them a shoe. Like the buckets that you put on your feet with holes in them. You can't even use them with a bucket, they have got holes in them. So if you think about it, right, like before those were popular, no one in their right mind would put that object on their foot and adorn their body in a way, such a public fashion, right? Then they became popular because they reached a sort of a tipping point. In data, you call it an information cascade, but whatevs. And like, then all of a sudden, everyone's wearing them. And like, you got accidents because people's like toes are getting cut off in like, you know, the escalators and stuff because they're not, you know, anyway. And then at some point, people stop wearing them and then look at photos and just feel a sense of regret, right, of all being there. So if you think about Donald Trump, right, he's a bit like Crocs. Objectively and aesthetically, he has a malformation of what a president should be, sound like, and look like, right, because he looks like a giant Cheeto, right? That's not what a president looks like. It's not what it sounds like. But you know what? Sometimes, like right now, what's on trend is ugly shoes. It used to be, you know, Crocs used to be popular. Now ugly shoes are. I have some, right? And at some point, people stop appreciating that aesthetic. But what's really interesting is that people will literally adorn themselves with ugliness. And that is, to me, what Donald Trump is. People will regret him in the future. But right now, he's on trend. You know, one of the first conversations that I had when I first met, quote unquote, Steve from America, you know, turns out later was Steve Bannon. I met him in a hotel room in Cambridge, and he asked me all these questions about culture. What is culture? What are you studying? How does it apply to culture? And I talked to him a lot about fashion fashion, because if you think about what culture change is, you can use the same words as a trend. You're creating an aesthetic that people are adopting and changing their behavior, and it can be so powerful that you'll adorn your body in public with something. And so for me, when you look at culture, whether that is fighting a culture war in counterterrorism, or whether that is pushing out the next little black dress, it's the same fundamental principles, because it's looking at culture. And when you look at how all of this, sort of all these, as you were mentioning, these sort of personality surveys and whatnot, and how that applies to a broader campaign for enduring culture change, if you think about the words that we use to describe ourselves as people, or our friends as people, right? We use the same kinds of words and adjectives to describe people as we do for ideologies, as we do for cultures, right? So I could say I'm open-minded, I'm tolerant, I'm extroverted, I'm outgoing, I'm easygoing, etc., right? We could also describe California that way, right? And so perhaps there is a latent feature, or what you would call a latent feature, in that when we unpack our own language of how we describe ourselves and how we describe groups of people, that we use the same words. And so one of the things that we started researching at SCL, which later then got acquired and became Cambridge Analytica, was what are the building blocks of culture, and what is culture? So if you think about something called a normal distribution, or sometimes it's called bell curve, right? You've got like this peak of lots of people kind of in the middle, and they've got some like extremes on either side, right? And if you think about like if you indulge in some like very light stereotyping, and I'm risking like offending people here, so bear with me, I do have a point. That if you say, what are Italians like? Right? Okay, they're more extroverted, they're passionate, maybe they're a bit neurotic, whatevs. I've dated Italians, so I can say that. And what are Germans like? Okay, they're more orderly, they're conscientious, they follow rules, they're quieter. Okay, so perhaps, but when we go to Italy, or when we go to Germany, there's lots of people like that, but then there's also people who aren't like that, right? So actually what we're talking about in our stereotype is the peak of a curve, in data terms, right? And all that curve is just lots of people who fit that position on whatever it is that we're measuring on that curve. And so one of the things that we realized is that part of the building blocks of culture are people, and part of the building blocks of people are dispositional attributes. So if you can profile dispositional attributes, and you can profile people, all of a sudden, enduring culture change becomes moving a curve, and the mean of a curve from point A to point B, and that movement, or that deviation, actually can be translated into a specific list of specific targets with people who have those traits who need to be moved one way or the other. And in that way, you can literally build a list of people that if they change, you change your culture too. And that was important for the military, because if you are trying to create enduring resilience against, for example, extreme Islamism, you've got to first figure out what are the units of Islamism, what makes somebody more or less prone to adopting these beliefs, and how can you build psychological resilience in that target group. On the flip side, you could also turn people into psycho-racists.
Indeed. This is all, the tools for you in this are Facebook data at the end of the day.
Yeah.
And where
the preliminary research that DARPA was funding was based on Facebook. And you know what's really funny? Facebook actually then later applied for patents for psychological profiling using Facebook data, and then hired some of the people who built the app from Cambridge Analytica.
Is that right?
Yeah.
So
quote-unquote victims here.
When Cambridge Analytica, the victims, as Alexander Nix would say.
They knew what they were doing.
When Cambridge Analytica did this, collected this data, and on the people that were taking surveys and questions and quizzes and things like that, and others in the entire social web, were they exploiting a loophole? Were they just doing this better than everybody else, or were they doing something quite different? And are there others out there doing it now?
Is it a loophole or a feature? I mean, think about it, right? Literally look at the layout of Facebook, the physical layout of Facebook. You've got a likes page, right? when was the last time you scrolled through the 300 pages on your likes page? When was the time you went to your friends and clicked on likes and then just kept scrolling and scrolling and scrolling and scrolling and scrolling and scrolling, right? These likes actually serve no purpose in their display, right? But they make it really easy to take because it's all structured. And when you take Facebook data, that data then gets used in a database for targeting on Facebook, right? So there is a perverse incentive on some of these platforms to create systems that are leaky. Because it doesn't really serve much of a commercial purpose. Well, at least if you're short-termism, if you're thinking is short-termism, right? It's like saying like seat belts aren't really needed in cars. But you know what? You know what seat belts have done? They've maintained consumer confidence in the auto industry because they kill less people, right? And so this is where I think Facebook really doesn't understand that actually creating safe systems and creating privacy by design as a starting point, and also transparency by design. You know, one of the perverse things about Facebook, like they always call themselves a community, but like it's not, because you can't actually see what's happening. So, you know, inherent in like a community, right? Like what we're doing here, you've got a platform, somebody talks, everybody understands and hears what that person is saying. If that's bullshit, someone can call me out. Like if I'm a candidate, right, and I say something, I lie, right? Like, you know, news shock, lying happens all the time in politics, but the difference is that the media can call me out, or an opposition candidate can call me out, or civil society or the members of the public can call me out. And also, that community has a shared understanding and a common understanding of what's actually being said, right? But the difference about what's happening on Facebook or other social platforms is rather than me just speaking in public in a public forum, I can go to each and every single one of you and I can whisper in your ear something. And I can whisper in your ear something with the benefit of having followed you around months on end, read your conversations, listened in to what you say, what you're interested in, what you watch, what you listen to, and know exactly the types of things that you connect with and you don't connect with. But I can also do it invisibly. So no one in this community actually even sees me going around whispering into people's ears. And also, I may not look like who I actually am. So you don't even know sometimes that someone is whispering something into your ear. And when you think about the effects on our democracy, right, it degrades or eviscerates the public forum, the public nature. This quote-unquote community that Facebook has created is actually the degradation of our public forum, because you can't actually see what happens.
And in those whispers, you're not necessarily saying the same thing to each person, are you?
No.
Whereas somebody on the platform, everybody hears this, what we're speaking.
Disinformation is like magic. It feels real, and you enjoy what you see. You enjoy being deceived because it's something that you want to see. That's what the power of disinformation is, and that's what makes it so dangerous, is that people enjoy receiving it. It's not like you're receiving something that you don't like. It wouldn't work that way.
Indeed. And now you're described as, and you are a whistleblower for the events that occurred and brought this out.
I blow them whistles.
You blew that whistle. Can you take a minute just to describe for us what it's been like for you as a whistleblower? You know, an example of something that you've had to go through or done.
Girl.
One good example.
Do we have an hour? We don't. So The Guardian approached me, and I originally was an anonymous source for their early reporting on Cambridge Analytica. They actually were investigating Brexit to begin with, and it led them to Cambridge Analytica because actually, by the way, British Columbia, Victoria, there was a company in Victoria that caused Brexit. 40% of all Vote Leave spending went to a tiny little company that was actually a subsidiary of Cambridge Analytica in Victoria, BC, that was recently ruled all illegal. And so they started looking at all these sort of Canadian players in this company that led them to Cambridge Analytica. That led them to me. Because they kept talking to people and they say, oh, if you want to understand what's happening, you got to talk to this guy, Chris. So anyway, I give them a bunch of documents, which I nicked, because when I left, I was like, oh, this shit's like really fucked up. And so I just kind of took everything. And those articles became the most read thing last year on The Guardian. So obviously, people were interested and wanted to hear more. Because it talked about all these new dynamics of how digital intersects with our democracy and all these like new kinds of players or entities that, previously we never even had to think about information warfare in an election unless we were like Zimbabwe. And so they came to me and they asked me, there's more sort of credibility to a story when somebody comes out with a name and a face and they actually can talk about it. But the problem was that after they put out those stories, Guardian got sued left, right, and center. And there was another company that was involved in the story called Palantir. Palantir was started by Peter Thiel, and its seed investment was from In-Q-Tel, which is the CIA's venture fund. And so all the stuff that, for example, Edward Snowden was talking about actually was, a lot of it was built by this company, Palantir. And the whole beginning section of one of the main articles that they wrote was talking about Palantir's involvement and how Sophie Schmidt, who's the daughter of Eric Schmidt, the chairman of Google, was working at SCL Group and introduced SCL Group to Palantir. She sues with a totally spurious claim, but it was going to be really expensive, so The Guardian took it all down. And so they come to me and they say, hey, we want you to be like the face of this thing. And I go, girl, you just took that down. You don't stand up. So you want me to like ruin my life? Fuck no, right? And then I said like, look, there's been tons of stories on like data breaches, like, oh, they kind of go on like page 8 of the technology section, and it's like, oh, like half the country's like MasterCard information was stolen, and people go, oh, that's too bad. Next, right? And so I go, like, there's been lots of these stories, and they don't necessarily make an impact because of how they're talked about. So anyway, I made a deal with them. I said, hey, you got to find a partner newspaper to back you. And that partner needs to be in the United States where you've got the First Amendment, where you can't be sued for the things that you can be sued for in the UK. So I made them grit their teeth and talk to their main rival, their frenemy in journalism, the New York Times. So then they formed a partnership with the New York Times to co-publish. And I also said, I don't want any political journalists reporting on this, and I don't want any tech journalists reporting on it, because they report shit that is inaccessible to most of the public. So The Guardian gave the story to the arts and culture section of The Guardian, a team of all women, who typically report about museums, music albums, etc. And that was one of the most important things that they did, because these were women who could barely use Facebook, let alone talk about algorithms and machine learning. But that was great because they were actually the audience. And so they had to learn the story and then distill it into something that actually mattered to normal people, right? But when I was talking to New York Times and Guardian, they kept on saying this is like, it was all documented. There's thousands of pages of documents that I handed over because I just nicked everything. And they kept on saying, like, this is so documented, and it's the New York Times and Guardian, right? They don't cut corners when it comes to validation of facts, right? You have to have like 5 pieces of corroborating evidence. Anyway, so that's when we went to Channel 4. Channel 4 is the sort of punchier version of BBC, and they do undercover operations. And we went to Channel 4 and we said, look, if you get these guys in a room, they will tell you what they do. So we went through this whole undercover operation, went through the head of the legal of all the channel, and we finally got authorization to do it. We had to plan out, like, we had to get actors, we had to plan out the whole thing. And
a bona fide sting operation.
Yeah, a sting, yeah. And there was cameras everywhere. Like I got to go and meet this dude in some like random empty building in London who like supply, you know, when you get hidden cameras, like those guys are all a little bit weird, and you know, it just has his wares on the table, and it's like all these little cameras. You can put cameras in everything, man. So anyway, so we had the first meeting. It was in a private room. And they were like very like cagey, and they're like, oh, don't, just leave it to us, like, we'll, you know. And I said, like, they probably think that the room is bugged, because it was. And so they decided that we should do it in a restaurant, because if you go to a restaurant and you let them pick the table, it's less likely that it's going to be bugged, because you got to pick the table. So they rented out an entire restaurant. Everyone in that restaurant was actors. The people, the ladies beside with the handbags, actors. Right? The waiter, actor, right? And there were cameras in fucking everything. That risotto that she's eating, camera. Handbag, camera, right? And that's when they talked. And so they said, you know, okay, we'll work for you, client. And here's the premise of the sort of background of the operation was we picked Sri Lanka because it was close enough to their Indian office, but still labyrinthine enough. I mean, Sri Lankan politics is so convoluted that you can barely figure out what's what, right? And the premise was somebody from the former government had their accounts frozen, which was a common problem, and so he needed this minister to reopen his account so he could take all the millions, and there'd be a cut for whoever could do that. So of course, their first proposition is, well, of course, in this situation, I like blonde Ukrainian hookers. We'll fly them in. We'll set up a sting. It was very meta, because they talked about a sting and a sting. And we'll get these sex workers to put them in a compromising position. We'll film them taking bribes, and then we'll take all of that and give it to the minister, and the minister will definitely open up your account in that because we'll blackmail them. And we've got all kinds of private intelligence firms that can do all of that. Don't worry. And we had that all on camera. And so we had this situation now that it was lawsuit proof. And now it was even more credible because you've got all these people that we're talking about with these sort of extreme allegations, albeit well documented, now admitting to it on camera.
Well, I think as shocking as the whole thing was, that's even more surprising. It sounds like it's straight out of a movie. But I want to thank you, Chris, for sitting with us and telling us all about that.
Cheers, thanks for having me.
Thank you.